the University of Minnesota program in human sexuality. The topic of this program is Sexuality and Disability Adjustment. Leading the panel discussion is Dr. Theodore M. Cole, professor in the University of Minnesota's Department of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation.
My name is Ted Cole. I'm a physician at the University of Minnesota Hospitals, and I work in the Department of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation.
I'm Richard Davis. I'm a student at the University of Minnesota, and I've been involved in the program in human sexuality at Research East.
I'm Nancy Crew, a counseling psychologist at the University of Minnesota, also in the Department of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation.
I'm Barbara Eimer, and I've been with the program in human sexuality, as Rich has, since its inception.
Also, part-time. What did you tell us?
Housewife.
Housewife.
Secretary.
Well, the thing I would like us to try to do is I would like to examine the possibility that there exists a relationship between how a person adjusts sexually in his sexual life with how a person adjusts in other aspects of his life. And I guess I'd especially like to consider that among disabled people. Now, it seems like there might be a relationship there. Maybe we could talk about that.
I think that that kind of hypothesis makes sense, that there would be a relationship. But I guess that I'd also like to make the point that it would be okay to be concerned about sexuality even if it didn't relate to anything else. I think that the healthcare professions are becoming more and more concerned about the quality of life, and that rehabilitation is no longer being directed solely toward physical restoration, that we're concerned about how a person lives, and sexuality is a very important part of that total quality of life.
Well, you know, Nancy, I really agree with that, but in some of the circles where I operate, some people sit in the back of the room, thin-lipped and critical, saying that if you can't relate everything in rehabilitation to some kind of physical betterment or vocational betterment, then you can't justify it.
I think that actually that the sexuality can stand on its own. A well-adjusted person sexually is fine in and of itself, but it does relate to getting a job. I know in my own personal experience, when I began to deal with my own sexuality, I also began to move out into other areas. I became a student. I became much more involved with other people. I become more interested and able to sustain interest in setting goals for myself and things like that. So I think there's definite relationship between how I feel about myself and how I move out and relate to people in work situations or in the general public.
Well, go ahead, Barbara. Excuse me.
I was going to say, as I look back, where I had worked at the university as a secretary for 11 years, and then had gone into the program in human sexuality, and I think that as I became more had a better feeling about myself and where I was going, what I was doing, that I finally cut my, what do you want to say, strings with working as a secretary, where I had also had my rehabilitation and moved out into getting a job in the community, and also in spilling out and doing other things.
Well, I'm interested to hear the two of you say that. I guess I wouldn't feel that it would necessarily be true for everybody who's disabled, but I do believe it probably is for some. And the word comes to mind, bait, if I can use that in a sexual discussion. But sexuality is a bait. It's an enticement for many people. It certainly is for me. And I think that if I were disabled, sitting at home, feeling sorry for myself, in the living room with mother taking care of me, I'm not going to get much sexual satisfaction that way, at least not with partners. I'm not. If I want to have sexual satisfaction, if I want to have sexual comfort, I'm going to have to get out of the home. I'm going to have to do something. So it seems to me that sex can be a bait, an enticement, to draw someone out of a protected environment of the home, of the living room.
Yes, and I think it can also go the other way, too, that if you get into a relationship and you find that, like in my own personal experience, that you're in a relationship you can't sustain because you're not prepared for it. I think the enticement of a job can also work to sustain a relationship. I think, you know, you can come at it from either end of the stick, so to speak. You know, if I see that I can keep a relationship going because I can take care of myself and bring home some self-respect and money and things that are necessary for any relationship, then it works both ways. There's definitely.
Yeah, I go along with that, Rich. It was a really good feeling to me to have my job and to bring home money and to buy clothes and to buy a car and do all of this on my own. But it also provided for me the opportunity to do more dating, especially with working in a very large hospital.
So your work life related to your dating life, and I guess that's true for most everybody, I guess, whether you're disabled or not. But a disabled person, especially one who's either in an institutional setting, a hospital setting, or at home, and not out on the job, perhaps not to that point, or perhaps will never get to that point, sometimes think that that person might have even more time to think about sex than the busy person who's running around working and considers himself able-bodied. And that kind of runs contrary to the usual message that, well, you don't have to talk about sex to the disabled. They don't think about it.
I think that's a stereotype that I can sort of understand a lot of people having. But in my own personal experience, I mean, I thought about sex all the time. You know, and much of it was in frustration over it, you know, not knowing what to do with all those feelings and everything. So it is on your mind. On top of that, you have all the media that's always thrown at you. And you have other people going about their normal relationships, and you're always on the outside. So sex is always there, one way or another. You have plenty of time to think about it.
I had suffered a lot of frustration. That's a real good word, I think, Rich. And until just really quite recently, with the advent of the program in human sexuality, where would you go with these feelings that you had, things that you wanted to talk about, and because, you know, sexuality, there wasn't such a word associated with being physically handicapped. You know, when you sustained an accident, so to speak, such as mine, a traumatic one, it was like, you know, sex went right out the window right then.
Well, Nancy, you're in the business of counseling people. That's what you do, I guess, just about all day, every day at work. And so a lot of the people you're counseling probably come into the hospital already in primary relationships of one kind or another. And I wonder if, looking back on our careers in rehabilitation, whether we've always paid a lot of attention to helping people maintain their relationships they had already developed before they ever became disabled and came in the hospital, or is that something new that we're doing just lately?
I think it's definitely something new. We've recently completed a major follow-up study of people with spinal cord injury, people who were in the hospital as few as 3 years or maybe as many as 30 years ago. And we encountered a number of people who said that they had very deep concerns in these areas and they simply weren't dealt with. I remember particularly one woman who sustained a spinal cord injury and assumed that there was nothing left for her sexually, even though she was married. So she went home and the physical relationship between this woman and her husband ended. And as you might expect, it wasn't very many years before the marriage itself ended, and she was sent to a nursing home. I guess that I take that sort of responsibility very seriously. I think that it's really a tragedy when we see relationships neglected as part of rehabilitation.
Well, it's been said that to the extent that us able-bodied folks don't deal with the disability of with the sexuality of a disabled person, may be saying something about the fact that, hey, we're pretty uncomfortable with our own sexuality. And because we're uncomfortable with our own sexuality, no way are we going to bring it up with that disabled person over there or that disabled person over there. But you all know me well enough to know that I don't have very much of that discomfort anymore. That's been kind of beaten out of me by knowing people like you and by knowing people like you. And so I've come to have some comfort with it. Just today I had an interesting experience. I talked to a young man who was injured just recently. and he's getting ready to leave the hospital. And I was talking to him about information that he needs in order to go home. We included in that sexual information. What does he really feel he needs to know? And he said, look, he said, I haven't even been home yet. I'll get to that. Let me get home. Let me have some experience. Then I'll come back and talk about it. And I was kind of pleased with the fact that I was bringing it up, and he was saying, that's okay, I'll get to that later, and I'm glad to know it's there, but I don't have to do it right now. I really don't have the opportunity to know what to do with it now in the hospital.
I think really that someone who's talking like that should be sort of pushed again into realizing that sure, you can deal with it later if you want to, but if you don't begin to deal with it now, it's going to come, you're going to be involved in things that you're not prepared for.
Mm-hmm.
At least I wish someone had set me down 20 years ago, you know, and said, look, this is what's involved in sexuality, and this is how you've got to learn to see yourself and your relationships with other people, and get a good look at the immature sides of yourself and how that relates to sex. I think I would have gone a lot farther, a lot faster if I could have really had some support from the institutions that I was in.
How old were you when that first happened to you, Richard, when someone in an institution actually talked to you about sex?
I was 38.
38.
Yeah, kind of late, but better than late than never. Yeah, but if through my adolescence, along with everyone else in my family, we weren't educated specifically about sex. We were raised on a farm, and we were assumed that we all could watch the animals, I guess, and pick it up. But no one sat down with any real serious education. I really feel myself that because of my disability, it was assumed that, well, the other kids will learn and Dick will get by because he doesn't really need it anyway, and he's smart enough to think things out for himself.
Yeah.
But I needed the support, and I didn't have it.
Well, I don't know that if it's just able-bodied people who are uncomfortable with sexuality, I'm sure that simply because a person is disabled doesn't automatically mean that all disabled people are going to be comfortable with sex. I think that the person who works in an institution or in a rehab center probably better do darn well to recognize that if he or she's uncomfortable bringing up the subject of sex, it may well be that disabled client or patient over there may be equally uncomfortable in reacting to it and dealing with it. And so you've got two discomforts, and you just have to work that through. And I guess that takes some practice, some skill, a fair amount of interest.
What I'd like to say to that, Ted, is that with working in the Department of Physical Medicine for a period of time also, I found, as I look back, that I became very anesthetized, so to speak, to other disability, and it really didn't bother me. Mm-hmm. But when I got away from there and became interested in the program and then started dealing with sexuality, as I see it a more broader thing now, in my relationship with Rich and starting out, I was really repulsed, frankly, mm-hmm. by him until I got to know him. After I got to know you, it just completely kind of left, and you were doing things like I saw you in a pair of shorts once, and no way at the time that I had seen you in a pair of shorts would I have ever put on a pair of shorts. And I thought, wow, this is really something, He is so comfortable with himself, and I thought that really helped me, though. No kidding. It really said something to me.
No, I think I even now tend to prefer or look for, seek out able-bodied people. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean that I exclude the disabled. I find if you really analyze it, if I find a disabled person sexually attractive to me, I'll move in to try and establish a relationship. But I tend to think of the able-bodied is easier to deal with just logistically.
Well, I think, there's so many parts of me and of us. I can't put parts of myself in compartments, and I hope I wouldn't try to do it to other people. Yet I feel that if if I were to have a sexual maladjustment in my own life, that somehow that would spill over into other parts of my life that would show. I wonder whether anybody else would agree with that based on either your personal experience or your observations of others.
I don't understand what you mean by sexual maladjustment, I guess, Ted.
Well, if I had a problem with my sexuality
Okay.
and had difficulty relating sexually to people, is it possible that that would influence how I relate in other areas with people?
I think that that makes sense. People are an entity, not a collection of parts. And to the extent that you've got problems in one area, I think that it makes sense that you're going to be less free to act in other areas. I had a really interesting experience last year. A couple of colleagues and I got a discussion group of people with disabilities together. They were people who, by and large, were pretty isolated. They were living alone or perhaps with parents, but not really having very much other interaction with people or with their community. With one exception, I think that none of them was working or in school. They didn't belong to any organizations. They weren't dating any other people. They really seemed to be pretty much alone. And we decided that we'd start this discussion group and see if we might help people define some goals that would move them into a more active state. And I guess that this group was different from any other one that I had been aware of, and that we decided to begin by dealing with the people's sexuality, their feelings of sexual comfort, particularly about themselves. We had the idea that perhaps one of the things that was keeping them isolated was that if they were afraid of the possibility of sexual relationships with people, that maybe that held them back from relating to people in any other way. And so we thought perhaps they could become more comfortable in this area, that they wouldn't try to hold back from other kinds of personal relationships to the same extent. So we put them through the sexual attitude reassessment workshop and gave them a chance to think about their own sexuality and to talk it over with each other. Then we spent some additional group discussion sessions in the following weeks talking about this. And eventually the discussion sort of naturally led into other areas, and we began to work on some vocational goals and some other kinds of goals. And we really saw some very interesting changes in the lives of these people. It was a small group. There were just 8 of us, and we didn't have a control group, so it's really hard to make any sort of scientific conclusions. But we saw one person going back to work, another who had never been successful in completing anything, actually follow through with an educational program.
Are
And
these people who had had the opportunity to have a rehabilitation program in the past?
yes, they had had a rehabilitation program, each of them, but they had also been out for an extended period of time. It was not something that was recent for any of them.
So you saw some changes in their lives, and what I think you're saying is that there may have been some facilitation of that through their having considered their sexuality.
That seemed to be true. We asked them how they felt about it, and the response that they gave us was, yes, it was important to deal with sexuality first. That really helped us to move more quickly in terms of other areas.
Well, Richard, you've made the point in the past in conversations with me that you think disabled people ought to be more than just encouraged to recognize their own sexuality. You said you believe they ought to be kind of pushed into recognizing their own sexuality, and I think you've had some arguments for that.
I think that they definitely need to be confronted. Everybody's going to do what they want, finally, with themselves. But I think they have to be confronted with what the deeper issues are. Relationship. I think they have, first I can speak about cerebral palsy and the tendency of cerebral palsy people to become dependent people, taking people and expecting the world to serve them kind of thing. If you get into a whole string of relationships of dependency on parents, on girlfriend, husband, wife, whoever it is, and you do for me, that everyone is an extension of doing things that reflect you, but they're doing it and you're not doing it, kind of thing. This kind of dependency really destroys relationship. And so I think it's those kind of things that the people need to be pushed into, to realize that it's that it's really a life or death, psychologically at least, kind of a issue that people have. That's why I feel the pushing is sort of, people can't tell people what to do with their sexuality, but the issues need to be pushed.
Rich, something that it just entered my mind with pushing the handicapped, I'm thinking about the other, you know, the husband, the parents, or whatever, and maybe parenting or taking care of that person, and or wanting to, which could make it very much harder for that person to kind of even pull away if he's
You're
not.
talking about
Yeah, if he's not-
overprotective
yeah.
parents, or even a spouse that's protecting or over-mothering or whatever.
You know, there's a lot of things related to disability that could keep you, I
I
guess,
would
in an
think that
isolated
even anybody who
situation.
wants to protect her mother or parent, it only goes to a point. And then when it really gets to be a lot of work and a lot of tension and conflict with it, then it breaks down. Most people at least fantasize themselves, I think, as having some measure of independence and in their own right, ideas and feelings in their own right. And when someone else is a barrier to the expression of that, it can cause conflicts. So dependency to me is no relationship at all, really.
I guess to me, being married, I see it probably from a different way. I could see where this, I probably wouldn't have the objectivity to see. I would hope that I would, but being so close in a relationship sometimes and playing several different roles, I can see where this would be kind of hard, because I do parent sometimes, and I like to be parented.
Well, I think those things all can go on in a
Yeah.
healthy relationship.
Yeah,
But
that's
we're
good
talking,
point.
I'm thinking of an overemphasis where that is the whole thing that's holding the thing together, is that somebody's taking care of me, or I see somebody as somebody to get me through, and become almost totally insensitive, really, to their needs in themselves, you know.
It seems to me that one of the usefulnesses of including sex in a work role with people whom we call patients in hospitals is that, to me, sex is kind of a soft underbelly of many of us. Certainly not all of us, but many of us. That is, if a person can talk with me and I talk back very honestly about sexuality, honestly, sincerely about it, it's difficult for me to parent that person as a physician.
Yeah.
And it allows me to get into a discussion which I think then spills over into other areas of that person's life that I really need to know about if I'm going to be a good physician. I think that sex facilitates that. I think that also sex after all does tend to involve bodies, and it's kind of a way of testing out one's body. It's a form of body testing, I guess, which I think, if done and done successfully, might lead a person to be willing to test his or her body in other areas too.
Yeah.
So if you don't
I
want to
would-
become involved in parenting, especially in a married relationship like my own, just bring in sex and that'll cut it right off.
Well, I think that it's very important to people to be able to feel good about their bodies. It's certainly true for me. I would guess it is for others, and it might be especially true for people who have physical disabilities. How do you get to feel good about your body? By someone telling you about it? Or might it be helpful to have some pleasant body experience with your body?
Yeah, I'll go along with that, because people could tell me almost anything about it. And what I discovered about my own body is first of all, I had to discover that in a lot of ways I really didn't realize how much I didn't like it, or how self-conscious I was of it, you know. But if I was thinking of myself in a relationship with a woman, a lot of that relationship was inhibited because, well, how am I going to do spontaneous things? How am I going to put my arms around her? What about this fact that my body stiffens up and I can't be romantic in a spontaneous way? And that Or what does she think of my hand, or the way my legs stick out at times, you know, and things like that. All of this self-consciousness kind of keeps growing, becomes habitual, and then you have to learn to like all over again yourself the way you really are. You know, I think when you get right down into the fact that someone will relate physically with you, and also on deeper levels psychologically, then that automatically helps you accept your body.
Mm-hmm.
Did me anyway,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
That makes sense to me. I think if I'm in a sexual relationship with a person, I'm in a very vulnerable position. Really unclothed, I guess, literally and figuratively. And for me to enter into that relationship with someone and have a person enter into that relationship with me says something good about the two of us. I think that can be used productively in trying to help people move further in their disability adjustments, in whichever direction they want to go. Disability produces, in some people, feelings of dependence, I think, and that course tends to make able-bodied society feel overprotective towards the so-called dependent person, and that protectiveness contrasted against the dependency, it just reminds me so much of how parents treat children.
Yeah.
And that makes the disabled person come out looking like a child. And gosh, all I got to do, Richard, is think of you as a child, and then I don't expect any adult behavior out of you.
Yeah.
Certainly not sexual.
That just brings a flashback into my mind about when I first came up to Minneapolis in the late 50s to be, you know, to live here away from my parents. My mother's first question was, well, who's going to take care of you, you know? And, you know, I says, well, we'll find out what happens when we get up there. And turned out that, by and large, I learned more and more that I didn't need as much care as I, you know, would sit around and wonder about if I was stayed there. And I kept telling myself that, well, I can't do it because so-and-so isn't there to do it. All that kind of stuff. It's a learning process all the way, you know?
I know, there was a woman at work today, and I've known this woman for over a year, and I was talking about driving, and she said, "But do you drive yourself?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, how do you get your chair in and out of the car?" And I said, "Well, you know, I just put it in and out. I've just worked out my own situation." I just can't believe that. And I said, "Well, I'll give you a demonstration sometime when it's nice." But I think what you said, Ted, that's really true, and it can be just all engulfing sometimes. And it, I know I've probably flipped the other way, so that I have become very, very hostile sometimes, because it just seems to me what should be so apparent by what I can do, it's like, can't you see this? And it's just, I don't know.
Yeah, well, it would be pretty hard, in my
It's
estimation,
unreal.
for a person to be a child, that is, made into a child, made to feel infantilized because of a disability, and then at the same time be expected to be a lover. That would seem kind of sort of two inconsistent roles.
It seems sometimes, too, that with the physically handicapped adult, that it's not just a physical thing you have, but it's a mental thing, too. And I know my relatives just think it's great that I'm married and have somebody take care of me.
Well, I guess that raises the possibility that some people might enter into relationships simply to have an attendant, although I guess that's not the kind of relationship I'm advocating. Well, maybe we can say that in our experience, there may be a relationship for some people between how they adjust sexually to a disability and how they adjust in other areas of their lives. And Nancy, to come back where we started, as you said, that may be all well and good, but perhaps in the 1970s, it's all right just to attend to people's sexuality for its own sake. I'd agree with that, too.